The backhand blades are one of the paired weapon categories from the DLC, in that when you two-handed, it actually does the power stancing combo, and this combo is very comparable to the power stancing curve swords. They get very similar speeds, damage, stance damage, and range. Now, unfortunately, the moveset is not as good as power stancing curve swords, as those movesets actually do hit simultaneously, which results in much higher DPS, and those jumping and running attacks are just broken. So when it does come to raw damage and DPS, the curve swords do have it beat, but that's not to say that the backhand blades don't actually have a good moveset, because there are a couple attacks that make them really good. One is going to be their heavy attack. Typically, when it comes to power stancing weapons and you do the heavy attack, it's just going to be for the one weapon, but for this weapon class, it actually does hit with both weapons at once, and it performs as a very nice like lunging attack that does decent damage, staggers very well. Like, it's a very good way to close in the gap. It also does get like this 4-hit running heavy attack, which is very comparable to the running attack that the power stance curve swords do. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't do as much damage as that one, but being that it's tied to the heavy, it actually does stagger better. But arguably, the best part about the moveset is going to be its guard counters, which have just recently gotten buffed to where they just get a lot more damage now with every single swing. And when paired alongside the deflecting tier, it can make for a very solid build, because obviously you can block with this weapon type, and the guard counters can just do ridiculous amounts of damage, hit so many times in quick succession to help proc the multi-hit talismans. And against some bosses, it's going to be borderline broken. Now, for me personally, I don't really consider it to be like the best guard counter in the game, as it still doesn't get any hype armor, it does have a longer animation, and does not get that good a stance damage, which I typically prefer to have with guard countering builds, because you're going to be hitting in the middle of an attack combo, so you want to have hype armor, potentially do things like piercing damage, and its output very high stance damage in just one hit. So things like thrusting shields, colossal weapons, great hammers, the sword lance, Dane's footwork, I'm probably going to prefer these a little bit more so than the backhand blades, but they're definitely going to be around about the top 5 when it does come to this particular type of build. Now, if you actually don't really care much for a deflecting or guard countering build, because you don't really find many uses for it, they still have their own unique skill options that just make them amazing. Things like blind spot and swift slash are very solid skill options that are just specific to the backhand blades. Now, I did just recently do a playthrough with both of these things, only using the skill, and both are probably S tier skills, but I probably lean more towards blind spot, as that one is just more consistent in my opinion. Any single time that you fight smaller types of enemies, this one can just straight up trivialize them. It's like an instant iframe dodge that goes straight into an attack, and it's going to stagger very well. It's going to be doing piercing damage. You can spam it over and over again, and it doesn't consume much FP. Like, there are so many bosses that can just be cheesed by this particular skill. Now, I wouldn't really use it the same way I use a lot of different other types of skills, in that I just like spam it over and over to just do amazing damage and just melt bosses, because it's not going to really do that, especially because it does have high stamina cost. But I do think it actually has very good uses, and it complements the backhand blades perfectly. Now, as for swift slash, this skill can actually be used more in terms of just melting bosses, as it does do more damage per hit. You can fully charge it to make it go like ridiculously far and actually do really good damage and do about 15 stance damage. Now, one thing that I actually did notice when doing my playthrough is that it's currently bugged when fully charged. For some reason, the aftershock wave effect just misses when you use it at close range when fully charged, and I don't know why. When you use it uncharged, it's perfectly fine, but it's a very easy skill to use. You can use it to like stagger enemies well, lunge past them. You could potentially use it as a mix-up, because you can always like let go of the skill early to just do the uncharged version, or just go in a different direction if you ever feel like you're in danger. And it can actually proc status effects pretty quickly too. So overall, I do think they're a very solid weapon class that have their own set of skills that separate them from power stancing curve swords, but they're probably still not going to be as broken. Now, to start off at the bottom, we have the SMITHSCRIPT CIRQUE, which honestly, in my opinion, is one of the best SMITHSCRIPT weapons in the game. It is one of 2 infusible backhand blades, and unfortunately does get the lowest amount of damage unless like you're at maximum level, because this thing does have scalings in 4 different stats. But for the most part, and basically every single infusion, it's just not going to get as much damage, and it also isn't going to have as much range as the backhand blades, and it doesn't actually have access to piercing damage as well, which if you are going to use particular types of skills like blind spot, you're going to do way more damage with the backhand blades, because it is going to be a poking attack. So when it comes to these particular type of Asher War builds, I would kind of stay away from the SMITHSCRIPT CIRQUE, but just like all the other SMITHSCRIPT weapons, they actually do have a projectile heavy attack, which does extend to the running heavy attack, jumping heavy attack, and even the guard counters, which, as I mentioned at the start of the video, these attacks are amazing. The regular charged heavy can lunge in really far, do respectable stance damage. The running heavy attack hits multiple times, it can help proc the multi-hit talismans, and the guard counters just hit so many times and just do amazing damage. So you're replacing all that with the projectile attack that's not going to do anywhere near as much damage, not going to do as much stance damage, and it's probably not going to swing as fast either. So when it comes to all these particular types of builds, whether it be skill spamming, guard counters, charged heavy attack builds, or even just R1 spamming, you're just going to be doing way more damage with the regular backhand blades. But the thing is, this projectile attack is still very decent. It goes relatively far. It's obviously almost not going to consume any FP, and it actually does have inherent tracking. As I always mentioned, the projectile attacks make the game incredibly easy because you don't really have to engage with enemies that much. So you can just sit at a safer distance and just tap the heavy attack, which is going to come out almost just as fast as a light attack. Now, typically when it comes to these SMITHSCRIPT weapons, the damage is not really that good, but that's because you're only swinging with one weapon, whereas for this weapon, it's a paired weapon, so you're actually swinging and hitting with both. So it's actually going to be respectable damage, and being that it's a lighter weapon, it's not going to consume as much stamina, which typically is actually a downside for a lot of the SMITHSCRIPT weapons. And I think the most underrated part about the weapon is probably going to be its guard counters. Yes, they're not going to do anywhere near as much damage, but it actually does serve as a projectile attack. So if you actually wanted to guard counter projectiles, or still guard counter against enemies that have like these longer types of weapons, it does do this like nice backstepping retreating animation and throws out the weapons. So I think it's a very solid and easy weapon to use that actually has a lot of different upsides. But the things that stop me from putting it any higher is that one, it's a SMITHSCRIPT weapon, so therefore you can't infuse it with things like Crack Blade or put any different types of weapon buffs onto it. And it's also just not going to get as much damage as all the other backhand blades. Number 2, the CURSEBLADE'S CIRQUE, which is the lone, unique, and non-infusible backhand blade in the game, does offer you the exact same moveset as the normal backhand blade, but it does just come with like a primarily dexterity scaling, so unfortunately you're not going to really have any build synergy with spells, but it actually can do the most amount of damage compared to all the other backhand blades with this dexterity build. Like it can quite literally just outdamage the backhand blade and SMITHSCRIPT CIRQUE that get an S scaling in dexterity. And on top of all that, it actually does come with passive bleed. Now, albeit it is only 45 bleed build up, but being that these are relatively quicker weapons that are paired, you still can proc bleed at a decent rate. And this particular weapon can be a pretty popular pairing alongside a guard countering build, because out of all the backhand blades, this one actually does get the best guard boost and best physical guarded damage negation. So when it comes to blocking, you're not going to take anywhere near as much damage or as much stamina damage with this particular weapon. So it's going to make the guard countering builds even better, and it can just do like more damage than the backhand blade and just have added bleed. Now for me personally, I probably still wouldn't like it more so than the backhand blade when it does come to these guard countering builds, because the fact that it can't be infused means that you can't pair it alongside Crag Blade or Blood Flame Blade or a Bleed Infusion, which these things are either going to offer you more damage or just more bleed buildup. And the fact that the CURSEBLADE CIRQUEs are a heavy weapon type, they're going to cost a lot more stamina, which for these guard counters, being that you're swinging around so many times, it's consuming a lot of stamina, and it's just way more with the CURSEBLADE CIRQUE compared to the backhand blades, which these are just like nitpicking as to why I do prefer the backhand blade. But if you do just want to keep it simple and you like the backhand blade guard counter, I would recommend us going with the CURSEBLADE CIRQUE, especially because its weapon skill does perform very nicely, and it can make for a pretty good pairing, because Deadly Dance for 15 FP, it does spin around a whole bunch of times, and there's pretty cool lunge flipping animation, and it can do like really good damage, especially when paired alongside the multi-hit talismans, which if you combo things like the guard counter into this skill, you're already going to max out the multi-hit talismans with how many times if you hit, and this skill can just be doing monstrous amounts of damage. And you do get the option of this follow-up kicking attack, which does not go that far, but the damage can be really good, especially after you've procced all the buffs, and it can do 20 stance damage, so the entire combo can do a total of 36 stance damage, which is very nice for a smaller and quicker type of weapon skill. Now, unfortunately, there are going to be a few different things that I don't like about this skill. One is going to be the recovery animations. They're just incredibly long for both parts, the swinging attack and the kicking attack. It just takes forever to recover, and you're going to get hit almost every single time. Now, thankfully, you actually can cancel it by doing a light attack, but doing a light attack is still going to prolong the animation, but do keep in mind that is something that you can do. And it also does a terrible job at proccing bleed. I did an entire playthrough only using this skill to do damage throughout the entire game, and I did not proc bleed a single time. And yes, I even fought bosses like Moog, and it didn't proc bleed once. For whatever reason, it just gets horrible status effect motion values, and you're only getting like 45 bleed build up for this entire skill, which is just as much bleed if you were to use a one-handed light attack. So hopefully that does get fixed alongside the annoying and long recovery animations. So there are a few too many downsides for me to put it into the S tier, especially because there are other different types of like these paired quicker weapons in the game that can offer bleed, like the Falx, that could probably do a very similar job but better. But when you pair this alongside a guard countering or deflecting build, I think it's definitely deserving of being a high A tier. And that's number 1, the regular backhand blade. This one just gets the most damage out of the infusible based backhand blades. It offers you the most range. It's the lightest one, only weighing its 2 units, which for a paired weapon is kind of ridiculous. So with these Blue Dancer's Charm builds, this one can be a very nice option. This weapon also does offer you some piercing damage as well. So when you pair it alongside things like the Blind Spot Ash of War, this is going to be the weapon to use, as Blind Spot is an incredibly quick skill that just gets instant iframes, does decent damage, it staggers enemies nicely, and with how fast that it comes out directly after after a dodge, more likely than not, you're going to be hitting enemies in the middle of an attack combo, which is where piercing damage comes into effect because this damage type just makes you just do more damage in a counter attack. And also, if you wanted to go with a swift slash build, the backhand blade is still going to be the best because it does actually offer you really good scalings with a bunch of different types of infusions. Something like a cold infusion can offer you a B scaling in both intelligence and dexterity. Or you could just leave this thing keen infused, get an S scaling in dexterity, throw in things like blood flame blade, and it could make for a nice build. Or as I've been mentioning, pair it alongside a guard counter build, throwing things like crag blade with a bleed infusion, and you're going to be doing monstrous amount of damage, proccing bleed in an instant. Like, the thing is just incredible with so many different types of builds. Now yes, as I mentioned, it's not going to perform as well as power sensing curve swords when it comes to those light attack combos or the jumping attack builds. Those ones are just like utterly broken. But the backhand blades still offer you amazing versatility with their movesets. Those heavy attacks, running heavies, and guard counters are just insane. Or even just pairing it alongside an Asher Ward type of build, the backhand blades just excel. So yes, I consider this one to be the best weapon in its class and one of the best weapons out of the DLC. Anyway, that is the backhand blades now ranked. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next video is probably going to be one on the throwing blades, which yes, there is only one, but I'm still going to make a video about it anyway because I've done like basically every other weapon class. So there's no point of skipping out on this one. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.